If you lived your teenage years and possibly your 20s during the Mega Drive generation, the chances are the gentleman we are about to speak to won't mean a great deal to you. However, to those in the know, these two men were pioneers and more than worthy of their place in the history of the games industry. At the very beginning of the 1980s, comics were still king when it came to home entertainment for kids. Weekly titles featuring sports, action comics with titles such as 2000 AD, Battle, and Eagle, where you may have been drawn into its pages through the artist's work of Oliver Frey. Oliver, an artist who regularly caught the eye with his weekly portrayal of Dunder in Eagle comic. This was the beginning of the era when the home computer boom, as it became known, was really taking off. Following early but innovative monochrome efforts such as the Sinclair ZX80 and ZX81, color computers like Commodore VIC-20 were beginning to appear in shops. The flood, however, didn't come until a year later. So many machines in the market at one time was always going to lead to a bloodbath. For every winner, there were two losers in the also-ran lane. The Sinclair ZX Spectrum was the runaway early hit. Small, great value for money, and right from the start it came with an exciting and original games library, which grew rapidly week on week. The established computer magazines of the time shrugged shoulders at the thought of lowering their tone to such as Game Software. The only real magazine to take games seriously at this time was Computer and Video Games. The Spectrum market, however, was so busy that it could easily fill a magazine all by itself. The time was right, and luckily, along came the right man with a great idea, and along with him, Oliver Frey and a great team at his side. That magazine was, to give its full and correct title, Crash Micro Games Action. Hello Roger and Oliver. Despite everything achieved before and since, there will always be a group of middle-aged computer gaming enthusiasts that will only ever associate you with Crash. It became their Bible. But where were you a couple of years prior to this, business or career-wise? How did you get from there to what was to become the landmark gaming magazine Crash, and equally important, if not ultimately more so, its home publishing company Newsfield Limited?
Okay, so if Crash had a homegrown fanzine feel to those early issues, that's probably down to the production values. We could only afford basic newsprint, black and white, not much in the way of colour. However, the information-heavy content came, from what we'd already learned about cramming as much into the pages as possible. You see, Roger and I, we're not Tyro magazine publishers. In our own way, we'd been revolutionaries in London in the late 70s and early 80s. We were kind of editor-publishers of a string of game magazines and news sheets produced by our company at that time, Street View Limited. By today's standards, they'd be considered really tame. From my point of view, I cut my teeth in the technical aspects of bringing out these magazines, with almost no backup team. It involved organising the typesetting, sizing and cropping of photographs, that was before their conversion to halftones, and page layout. In those days, page design was a very physical business. We were using pre-printed grid layout sheets, scalpels and cowgum for sticking stuff down, learning print pagination and reprographics. Now that's the business of turning paper layouts into 4-colour films, from which the printer made the printing plates. And then there's the question of distribution. Now that's a complex dance between retailers, wholesalers, and whichever company acts as the main warehouse and distributor. Interestingly, our distributor was a guy called Dave Gold, who also owned an adult magazine company and is currently the joint chairman of West Ham United. Now, all the knowledge gained with Street Level later made Crash and Newsfield possible. So then, by late 1982, Oliver and I were hankering for something a little more mainstream, so we sold the business and then we moved from London to Ludlow. Now this is a town that we'd known since the mid-1970s, and in that October, following the removal lorry up the A40, we had no concept of a computer games magazine. Ours was more of a move to the countryside and see what turns up kind of development. Oliver continued with his illustrative work, and I contributed articles to some of the London-based magazines. This was until Oliver's younger brother Franco visited, bringing with him a ZX81. Now this little machine was a revelation, although it wasn't until the appearance on his second visit, bringing with him a ZX Spectrum, that really set the ball rolling. Franco, working in his brother's electronics development company in Sussex, had dealings with a German customer. Now he wanted access to a very good supply of Spectrum games, since he found that almost none were available in Germany. Now Franco began sourcing cassettes for him, and he began to realise that the availability in Britain was also extremely limited. He suggested that the three of us could do well with a mail-order business, and so, in early 1983, the Crash Microgames Action Partnership was set up. We knocked up some adverts, principally to place in magazines such as Computer and Video Games, Sinclair User, and PCG, Personal Computer Games magazine, and operated from home at 85 Old Street, Ludlow. Now, shortly after, Franco and the Frey parents moved to Ludlow as well, renting a marvellous refurbished watermill on the River Thames. It had a large basement which became the mail-order department, while Old Street acted as the mail-order, editorial and catalogue design centre. The 2 8-page catalogues we produced in that period were heavily illustrated by Oliver, but were simply typed on A4 paper, with the drawings penned directly onto the pages, and then printed by our local Tortoise Shell press, a relationship that grew massively in the following years.
Oh really? Some latecomers to Crash may be surprised to discover that it was initially a mail-order catalogue with reviews. Do you remember how the transformation to a fully fledged magazine happened? Did you look at how other magazines were covering games at the time? Personal computer games had a growing personality, for instance. And did you find the task of creating a magazine dedicated to one facet of a single home computer quite daunting?
It didn't take long before wind of a Spectrum mail-order business operating in Ludlow reached the playground of Ludlow's C of E school. The knock at the front door after hours became commonplace. Boys with fivers in hand, eager for the latest game, and even more so for news of forthcoming releases. Access to a place that might have a game that no one else yet had was a powerful currency. Two slightly older Spectrum fans were to become important fixtures in the coming months. Chris Passy was a BT trainee engineer and capable spinner of words. Matthew Uffindell, he was at sixth form college and learning computer science and making sausages for one of the local butchers in his spare time. He was a dab-hand games player. Matthew virtually installed himself at Old Street and was there on the day I took a phone call from the managing director of a magazine distributor called Wells, Gardner and Darn. The man's son, it seemed, had received one of our catalogues. Intrigued, he'd shown it to the news buyer at W.H. Smith in Swindon, who told him that if this black and white rag turned into a real magazine, then W.H. Smith's would certainly sell it in all its stores. Having previously abandoned magazines, it looked as if Oliver and I might be able to start using the vast supplies of partly used and unused letter set we'd carted up from London for headlines again. The first thing we did was take a look at the way contemporary computer-related magazines handle games reviews. After all, our magazine, Crash, from the word go, was going to fulfil W.H. Smith's wishes as an all-games vehicle. Typing listings were out, heavy-duty techie stuff was out, wide-spaced typesetting was out, detailed games reviews were in, researched playing tips were in, technical stuff that mattered, i.e. joystick connections, RAM packs, and anything that boosted sound was in. Articles about software houses were in, and I was determined we would make pop stars of the programmers and games designers, something amazingly overlooked by the professional magazines. Most certainly, pages devoted to encouraging letters and offering reasoned responses was in. All those other magazines printed a few letters, but invariably offered no response. PCG, that's Personal Computer Games magazine, came closest to what I felt Crash could be. Though, even so, I felt it could be a little bit slight in the way it handled material. That's probably down to being a multi-format vehicle. I never for a moment thought Weed would do that. I mean, it was Spectrum or nothing. To tell the truth, I hadn't even much of a clue about the other machines, and the Commodore 64 had barely impinged into Britain halfway through 1983, as we prepared to take the plunge with Crash magazine. Indeed, as I gathered material for the first issue, the really daunting task was to fulfill the boast that Crash would review every single game ever released for the Spectrum. I think we did creditably in that claim, with the Guide Spectrum over several issues. Another daunting task was to work out how to handle the reviews. Now, it seemed sensible to employ the pool of would-be schoolboy reviewers who had been thronging Old Street for months. Afternoons often rang to vigorous attacks and defences of personal favourites. Matthew was my logical choice as a go-between, himself an avid player reviewer. He and I sat with printed forms which we handed the kids, in which they penned in the details and reasoning for their opinions. I think for the first issue of Crash I typed over 75,000 words, a lot of it my own writing and the rest my editing. With that, and wrangles with W.H. Smith's over the quantity of colour pages versus cover price, the planned for Christmas launch slipped into January, and Crash Issue 1, with a February cover date, went on sale on a propitious day in January, Friday the 13th.
Wow, okay. Crash was a hit right from the start, and with such a smash on your hands came inevitable rivalry from other magazines baying for the Spectrum readership. This can lead to both sides upping their game, changing their direction, or taking a direct swipe at the opposition. One of the most memorable swipes in the history of games journalism came in form of the issue 19's Unclear User supplement, a parody of Sinclair User, which at the time was possibly your main rival. the story of how Sinclair user took out a successful injunction against Newsfield, which forced unsold copies to be withdrawn from newsagents' shelves, is a well-remembered one. Can you tell us the story of how Unclear User came to be, and what, in your opinion, was the straw that broke the camel's back? In hindsight, did you regret this whole episode, or despite the financial losses, did you think that this admittedly very amusing and bitingly satirical episode should have just been laughed off by all parties?
I edited the first 18 issues of Crash, and some months before I looked for an assistant, which turned out to be Graham Kidd. He lived in Harborne, Birmingham, but was more than happy to make the move to Ludlow. Graham took over editorship in issue 19 when I moved over to Zzap 64, and carried to fruition a 4-page spoof of Sinclair User which had been brewing for some time. Teenage Reviewer contributor Ben Stone recalled that pretty much what we were saying was true. They were reviewing games that weren't finished, and no doubt getting told not to worry, as it would be fixed in the finished game. But just like everyone at Newsfield, Ben thought it was just Graham taking the piss. He was fed up with constant Sinclair User claims of exclusive this and exclusive that, when Crash had already published the same article, Revelation or whatever. As we know, Sinclair User's parent, the giant East Midland Allied Press, or EMAP, did not find Unclear User amusing at all, but the subsequent injunction did less harm than it might, since over 60% of the copies of Crash had already sold on the Thursday, Friday and Saturday of release. The injunction did not bite till the following Wednesday. More to the point, EMAP's barrister made the error of bringing the injunction before the Queen's Bench instead of the Trade Bench. EMAP wanted the injunction to stand for defamation of character, so they could immediately use the precedent to sue Newsfield for horrendous damages. But the judge in chambers, unfamiliar with the nature of EMAP's claim, immediately ruled that, in his opinion, the disreputable rural company had infringed Sinclair User's copyright because we had copied their use of the Times Roman typeface. Anyone familiar with copyright law knows that EMAP stood no chance of pursuing that through the courts, following the injunction against us, so it took months for their lawyers to regroup and come back with a detailed charge of defamation, by which time Crash sales were soaring, and the £60,000 out-of-court settlement, although painful, was hardly ruinous. Do I regret Unclear User? I regretted the look of pain on Franco Frey's face as he added up the cost of lost sales and the impending fine for settlement, but otherwise not. They called us rural pirates, as though only London-based magazines were the genuine item. And the reader reaction was so solidly in our favour, the sales of Crash doubled within the next few months.
Really? I didn't know that. May 1985 brought a new magazine from Newsfield, Zzap 64. New ideas and new staff, including at the time the young reviewers Julian Rignall and Gary Penn, and the future founder of Future Publishing, Chris Anderson, who infamously launched Future with a loan of $25,000. An early editorial move led to parting ways with Chris and taking over editorship of Zzap 64 yourself after just a couple of issues. Was this something you felt comfortable with at the time? You were in the position of being highly associated with the ZX Spectrum, and your move to the Commodore 64 even brought cries of traitor from some quarters. How did your move affect Crash and in turn Zzap 64? Did you set out straight away to change any of the building blocks Chris had put in place, or adapt the magazine to your own personal style right from the off?
With the growing success of Crash, it became inevitable that Newsfield would launch a Commodore 64 title, half in jest, but such whimsy at Newsfield often became a reality. So, following Crash, we thought a second title would have to be called Bang, and the third, obviously, would be WALLOP. The latter would become an AMSTRAD magazine. And in an editorial in Crash I had been very rude about Personal Computer Games magazine, though my defence was that Crash had been renamed Trash in an issue of PCG. You might imagine my surprise when I received a most polite phone call from a certain Chris Anderson, PCG's editor. He'd heard rumours that Newsfield was planning a C64 title, and could he apply to be its editor? His reasons were primarily twofold. He was fed up with editing a multi-format magazine, and he wanted to work on a single format, particularly the 8-bit Rising Star. Now, he lived with his wife in Yeovil and commuted daily to PCG's London offices, and our biggest commitment would be to base the new magazine's editorial not in Ludlow but in Yeovil. Franco and Oliver were reluctant, but Chris was such a catch we consented, and Chris thankfully refused the name bang, and so Zzap 64 was born.
Magazines could live or die not only by the size of their circulation, but also the size of their advertising revenue. A good review could make a game overnight. I personally remember deciding to buy whatever the gold medal was in the next issue of Zzap, for instance, before even knowing what it might be. A bad review could not only kill the game's success, but damage the software house. Was there ever any direct impact on future advertising revenue from certain bad reviews? Did a better review in a rival magazine ever back then the next exclusive? And how were those exclusives shared out? Was it generally lack of publishing dates, or were reviews promised to one publication or another well in advance of the game's release?
Magazines certainly require a level of advertising revenue to flourish, and perhaps more in the old print form than they do in digital format today, and advertisers, aware of the power they hold over a publication, are always tempted to exert some kind of pressure to get favourable reviews of their products. Now, the computer games industry was no different, however. It was always the slightly lesser than top software houses that came off loudest when a game suffered in a bad review, in Crash or Zzap 64. In one case I recall writing a pretty stinging rebuke to a certain co-owner and one of Imagine's ex-directors, who had shouted down the phone line that he would never ever ever advertise with us again after the 30% review his new game had received, unless we changed our attitude. I had to point out to him that in fact his company had never ever advertised with us, so what was the problem? As to the real giants, basically Ocean and US Gold, Dave Ward of Ocean block-booked both companies' adverts for all Newsfield titles, which of course meant they enjoyed big discounts. However, I never recall any pressure put on us for a good review. What they did instead, as did many larger software houses, was to send to Ludlow their best PR people, sometimes with coders, to playtest the games in production, and then to demonstrate the finished product. It was a system that played well for both sides. Our review teams got a chance to really play the games, and the publishers learned of any glitches or illogical acts well in time to put them right. I might sound smug, but I don't think a higher score in, say, CMVG than in a Newsfield title really changes the flow of exclusive previews and reviews. That the Audit Bureau of Circulation, the ABC, allowed Crash and Zzap a readership ratio of 4:1 speaks for the power those two magazines had over the buying public. What that means is that if Crash had an audited circulation of 104,000, the ABC said that we could legitimately claim that 416,000 people actually read the issue. The readership ratio was generally set at between 2.3 to 3 in those days.
Now that's interesting. Following the seemingly runaway success of Zzap 64 and Crash, Newsfield's third single-format magazine was AMTIX, a games magazine for the AMSTRAD CPC. Unlike those two publications, however, AMTIX had competition right at the start from AMSTRAD Action, which had beaten it to market by a matter of weeks. This was the first publication from ex-Newsfield employee and original Zzap editor Chris Anderson for then new startup Future Publishing. What was the reason attributed to the short life of AMTIX at the time? Did AMSTRAD Action sneak in just in time and not leave room for another direct competitor? Did you in turn feel competition from Future Publishing? In hindsight, was there ever any thought of what if Chris had stayed with Newsfield the previous year?
I feel, and Chris Anderson may disagree, that he would not have stayed all that long with us. it may have been a failure on our part that both Oliver and I were creatively involved at many levels, from editorial through to art production, whereas I feel that Chris was first and foremost a businessman, not so much a hands-on person. Indeed, his subsequent spectacular career proves that. Chris made a fine launch of Zzap, and it remains a sad fact of life that we parted company after issue 3. He made it to the shelves later though with AMSTRAD Axten, just about the same time as Newsfield's own Antics magazine, but he's certainly an advantage with the title's name. Newsfield took seriously the threat from AMSTRAD of legal action if any publisher attempted to sneak off with their brand name. I'm not sure how Chris did it, either license the name or just use it and say sue and be damned. Our launch editor Jeremy Spencer used his AMSTRAD choice and an anagram program to come up with the name Antics, the best of a bad lot of names.
Looking back on it, Antics was never the happy puppy that Crash and Zzap had been and were. The editing was weak and the team struggled, with Richard Eddy the only really inspiring person on it. He went on to do great things on the other magazines at Newsfield and later worked at Codemasters, as well as running his own PR company for a while.
Oh really? To Oliver, my earliest hands-on experience of your art comes from your work on Down There from the relaunched Eagle at the beginning of the 1980s. During my early teenage years, I enjoyed 2000 AD and Star-Lord weeklies. I always noted the names of my other favorite artists such as Brian Boland, Carlos Esqueras, Ron Smith, etc. As I was making a transition from comics to computer games, it was with great pleasure that a favorite comic artist was now providing artwork to my favorite new magazines and even comic strips at a later date with seminal sci-fi strip The Terminal Man. Did you have any sense at the time of the impact your covers could possibly be having on the popularity and even sales of the magazine? Classic image followed classic image. How did you cope with the mounting pressure of the growing range of magazines, not only the covers themselves but page designs and decorative art throughout reviews? Was the idea of a regular second cover artist ever discussed?
By the time Crash was muted, I'd had quite a few years as a professional illustrator, so I was only too aware of how much I could bring to the project. Eye-catching covers were needed to stand out from the crowds on newsagent shelves. Also, we wanted to get away from any staid computers are serious look. After all, Crash was about exciting entertainment for teens. The ZX Spectrum was an arcade machine at home. The games were what they were interested in. So we decided to treat them just like films, so our cover art fleshed out what on-screen sprites could only hint at. Full-blooded, realistically action-packed scenes of the game plots. As a partner in the project, my services came free and were liberally used. As editor, Roger steered the contents and the desired look. He and I discussed cover ideas until we felt solutions were found. We knew we had to create a monthly splash to ensure the magazine was read. The contents did the rest. Our readers liked the look and feel and kept coming back for more. Work pressure did mount with every new title we added to Newsfield's roster, and yes, eventually we did try out potential artists to take over some of my load. None of them proved to have the ability or stamina to sustain the constant against the clock production of editorial illustration, ranging from action, suspense to humour as I did, so I was stuck.
To Oliver, many classic covers were directly related to a particular game in the magazine. Did you ever play the games in question? Was gaming something you did in your spare time before working on a games publication? Did you ever feel restricted by the concept of creating art based on the computer games, or was the opposite in fact true, and in turn a simple game idea became something truly larger than life on paper? Did your imagination ever go too far and was restricted to what you could actually put on the cover in terms of violent sexual content and other form of censorship?
I'd only ever dabbled with one or two early cartridge games, and I never took up playing any of the games seriously. I know they were a thrilling concept and did my level best to sell the experience through my illustrations and to serve the various editors who ran the magazines to the best of my abilities. It was a fun challenge, and yes, Sometimes one can get too carried away when wanting to live up to the editorial team's wishes. That happened 1 or 2 times, but W.H. Smith could quickly curb that enthusiasm.
Really? I didn't know that. To Oliver. Some of my favorite Zzap 64 covers were not tied to a game, but to the magazine itself. The Magnificent 7 Reviewers cover in particular, and the classic Shoot 'em Up cover where the Zzap 64 logo was seen to be taking out Commodore user and computer and video games logos in a spectacular space battle. Do you have personal favorites among your body of magazine covers, or are there instances where you look back at some of those from the period and think, if I only had spent another week on that one?
Over the years we explored many ideas for striking cover images, including many that were purely seasonal or that centred on the editorial teams or readers, and even veiled attacks on rival publishers. That I find it impossible to answer the often asked question of what my favourite ones are. Some might stand out when looking back, some I naturally wished I'd had more time on, but that's the very nature of illustrating in the magazine world, and as long as readers don't notice, you live with it, successfully cutting corners when necessary. It's part of the job.
Wow, okay. To Oliver. You continue to be one of my favorite artists, and I recently picked up your excellent book, The Fantasy Art of Oliver Frey. But who are the contemporaries that you admired during your continuing career?
Over the years I've admired many examples of other illustrators' work, too many to name. These range from comic strips to paperback covers, film posters to magazines, illustrations. Some inspire, some I envied. All added to my visual vocabulary.
I see. To Oliver. Older fans will remember your sublime work on the Trigon Empire that was published in Look and Learn magazine in the 1970s. Was this your first comic strip work, and did you enjoy the experience of working on a long-running saga? The Trigon Empire was not a new strip but had begun in the mid-1960s. Along with titles such as this and later Than There, how do you approach taking over a well-established strip and making it your own?
My first paid-for comic strip was for Fleetway's War Picture Library in 1969, while I was still at film school. These 64-page complete story comics of World War II heroics were my apprenticeship. In the years to 1973, when I permanently settled in the UK, I must have produced over 20 including covers. I continued drawing them even though my newly found agent began finding me other clients, which spread my work to doing illustrations to further magazines and books. After a stint on Speed and Power producing a comic strip, SOS International, plus editorial illustrations, tanks, automobiles, science fiction, I was offered Trigon Empire, taking over from long-running illustrator Don Lawrence. The brief was to copy his painterly style, and I did the best I could until, invariably, I morphed it into my own. Naturally, customers who have been publishing a series for many years want to preserve a continuity of style. This was not the case with Dan Dare in the early 1980s, by which time the character had already been restyled into a modern look, which bore barely any resemblance to the original. To top that, Eagle Comic was now printed on newsprint, where what was required was a black and white line work to which colour was added by the printers and not the artist. I didn't enjoy this very much, so luckily Crash came to my rescue.
Incredible, such history. Over the last few years, you have been actively involved in the editing of several books that look at the history of the video games industry from various angles. Titles such as Ocean, the History and The Story of US Gold are on so many bookshelves. Do you think that the retrospective history of gaming and its culture is something you will never tire of being actively involved in?
After Newsfield came Europress Impact magazines, and then a book packaging company, of which more to follow later. But suffice to say that Oliver and I departed from the games world, leaving it in the capable hands of others, to concentrate on creating a stable of illustrated reference books for Prima Publishing, Now, when Prima went feet up after too much .com exposure in the digital market crash of 98 and 99, we made a management buyout of Prima Edition's side of the business and set up as Thalamus Publishing in January of 2000. From then on, apart from producing the fantasy art of Oliver Frey, our world revolved around a series of big book educational reference titles for international publishers, mostly on historical subjects. So if you asked me then if I would have ever again become involved in computer games, I would have said no. But that's when Chris Wilkins appeared, cresting the wave of retro gaming and undeterred by every barrier erected to keep former 14-year-olds away. I'm not sure whether I will tire of being actively involved in gaming culture, because, in a sense, I was never deeply involved as a gamer. I was more of a bemused onlooker who, early on, saw the power of computer games and the extraordinary creativity of machines such as the Spectrum and Commodore 64 unleashed. I mean, what I can say is, the past few years working with Chris have been fun and forcing me to remember things I'd forgotten about, even when I own all the binders.
Let's discuss Thalamus. Everyone knows Thalamus, but not everyone knows everything about Thalamus. Sanction, the first game, had everything. It was basically a Commodore 64 fan's wet dream. A seemingly undiscovered and amazingly talented programmer in the form of Stavros Fasolas from Finland. England's Rob Hubbard turning out a career-high soundtrack, an instantly classic package art by Swiss-born Oliver Frey, Matt Snip's inspired interpretation in the form of a wonderful cassette loading screen. The company really was off to an amazing start. Just how did you pull it off? Can you give us an insight to this then-fledgling software company and the team pulling the strings and turning the cogs?
Now, in one respect, Thalamus was an embarrassment for a company that published computer games review magazines, and this is a point not lost on Computer and Video Games magazine, which made noises about the inevitable bias Zzap would have towards its own games. I retaliated by pointing out that CVG's parent company, the still smarting EMAP, were actually owned by Beyond Software. Most praise for pulling off the first part of the Thalamus story must go to Julian Rignall. Now, he was shown a very early demo of what would later become the first Thalamus game, Sanction, when Stavros Fasolas met him on the Newsfield stand at the Personal Computer World Show in London. Julian raved about it, and Stavros was later persuaded to visit Ludlow, and both Gary Penn and Gary Liddon completely agreed with Julian. As matters began to get out of hand, I stepped in to say that neither Oliver nor I could have any management hand in a software company if we did go ahead. Conflict of interest, of course, so it was agreed to look for a managing director from a software house, and that turned out to be a regular Ludlow visitor, Activision's PR man Andrew Wright. Gary Liddon, who was more of a coder than a writer, although he was pretty hot at both however, had also begged to be sacked from Newsfield so he could join Andrew in Thalamus. And from that point on, I had nothing to do with Thalamus, and all praise must go to Andrew and Gary for gathering such a strong team around Stavros and piloting the game to fruition. In spite of our hands-off approach, it would have been silly not to have Oliver produce the artwork for the inlays, and in that he was as much as a work for hire to Thalamus as he was to the magazine editors for the covers and interior art. He was more of a master turned slave.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Staff changes and a period of financial unrest for parent company Newsfield led to Thalamus sadly closing and Eidos acquiring some rights. The Thalamus story does not end there though. In 2000, Thalamus became the trading name of a successful worldwide international publishing company. Can you tell us a little about this venture and the retention of the Thalamus name, which brings us to the present and Thalamus Digital bearing a familiar logo? Does Thalamus have a new home, and can you tell us more?
Well, after Newsfield came Europress Impact magazines, with Julian Rignall's younger brother Jonathan, Oliver Frey and myself running the company from Newsfield's Case Mill premises in Ludlow, but reporting to the Europress Group Board in Macclesfield. Suffice to say, it wasn't a particularly happy relationship, and culminated in the company's closure after Oliver and I resigned, when the board suddenly demanded we make over half the staff redundant. Instead, we took 19 of them to a new company called Archetype Limited, and in the last months of Impact I had encountered the commissioning editor of Carlton Books, a publisher and packager. One of their youthful lines was a hints and tips book for video games. They wanted the combination of playing and reviewing skills and the latest electronic publishing systems, which we had. This new line of business rapidly expanded into producing CD-sized books on popular music and rock legends. This we took on to Archetype, continuing with computer games books, the music line, extreme sports books, officially licensed US sports such as NFL and NBA, etc., and for Virgin books of golf and football records. Unfortunately, Archetype was founded on sand, and this was in the shape of co-director CFO Santosh Thomas. The investment he found to set up Archetype wasn't from a wealthy friend, but swindled out of Indian family friends based in Dubai. They were expecting their food oils business to expand into Britain, and instead ended up owning a publishing company. Santosh had anticipated making the $80,000 investment back speedily enough to then be able to use it as he had intended. For one, publishing and book packaging takes time, and it ran out. Second, Santosh was gambling heavily and losing. A year on from inception, everything came out, and once again Franco, Oliver and I were fighting to save the jobs of those who'd come with us from Impact. Carlton were keen, but still keener were a Californian publishing group, and in that April, Prima Publishing acquired the remnants of Archetype and set up as Prima Creative Services. Prima's primary interest was for us to continue producing ever more complex licensed game books to complement their own, mostly black and white output. Within a year, the president of Prima wanted his British unit to match what Carlton Books had been doing, who'd sold their games books, Impact produced, to Prima as if they were done by themselves, but diversifying into other subjects which could be sold internationally. We named this Prima Editions, and we recruited an acquisition editor and sales manager. In 1998 we hit the Frankfurt and London book fairs, with numerous titles ranging from pet care to history, majoring on illustrated history titles. At this time too, Prima was investing heavily in the .com bubble, and when that went bust, it took Prima with it. Prima Creative Services went first at the end of 1999. Franco, Oliver and I, we made a management buyout of the editions side of the business, including those books in progress, and we took several other staff and set up as Thalamus Publishing in January 2000. Why resurrect the Thalamus brand? Well, our co-investor, the owner of a large photo library, a natural fit for a publisher of heavily illustrated books, demanded the name International Media Solutions Limited, IMSL, and we were stuck with it. But we needed something short and to the point. Apart from the suitability of the name, we always loved the Thalamus Games logo, and since the company no longer existed, and the logo was Oliver's copyright, Thalamus made an ideal and unusual brand name. Between 2000 and 2009, Thalamus produced 43 hardback titles, usually of 192 pages, printed millions of books in Italy, Spain, Hong Kong and Singapore, and sold to more than 20 publishers in 12 countries. Principally a packager, Thalamus dreamed up possible areas of interest, secured a suitable expert author to write enough for 3 spreads, 6 pages, of the proposed project, which were designed and laid out. Then the sales manager hawked these around the world, and particularly at the major trade fairs, aiming to get as many varied publishers to agree a price and quantity to the finished book. With a successful sale, the author was contracted to provide the words, "Our photo library, co-shareholder, resource the images." Oliver supplied the innumerable illustrations, and, as a lifelong cartographer, I provided many maps for the historical subjects. Once the book was finished, discs were sent to the foreign publishers who wanted it so that they could translate at their cost English into their own language. The whole lot was then combined and fired off to the printer. The cost advantage of this system lies with the printer being able to print, say, 50,000 copies of the colour in one go, while only changing a 5th black plate carrying the text for each language in turn once the previous language had reached the required number of copies. The printer then shipped each publisher's bulk quantity to the foreign customer's nearest port, and Thalamus received its final third payment for the production. Of course, we also printed a quantity under the Thalamus banner for sale in the UK, unless we'd sold the book on to another British publisher. We closed Thalamus down in October 2009, the company having run its course in the face of the internet's growth, which appeared to the public to have replaced books as the source of reference reading, though that's still not true today. But that was an argument we could not win in the face of educational publishers going out of business all over the Western world.
Did this really happen? In a surprise to many, Newsfield's first hit magazine is coming back from the grave for a 2018 annual, a special hardback book recently funded through Kickstarter to great success. What can you tell us about this? When did this become an idea? Were there many legal wrangles to overcome to bring this iconic name back from the dead after so many years? The classic Crash logo was last seen, of course, sharing a masthead with its old enemy singular user many years ago. Seeing it break free and alive once again must feel great.
Now, the very idea of producing a Crash annual came about as a result of my working on several retro gaming projects with Chris Wilkins under his Retro Fusion label, including the histories of Ocean and US Gold. Chris had always wanted to publish a periodical, but was persuaded of the folly. And over a pub lunch in Ludlow last April, during the book signing for the Fantasy Art of Oliver Frey Extended Edition, the concept of an annual was booted around the table. I agreed to act as an editor and Oliver produce a new cover and some internal artwork. The possible spoiler in this was that some time back Damien Butt of Imagine Publishing of Retro Gamer magazine had managed to purchase the rights to Crash and Zzap 64 from the Duchy of Lancaster. This is the graveyard of forgotten copyrights. And in turn, these rights passed on to Future Publishing when they acquired Imagine. I suspect no one at Imagine was even aware that they received those rights along with other far more important bits and pieces, including Retro Gamer. Therefore I concluded, and assured Chris as the publisher, that there would be no hindrance to our annual. I was wrong. Future woke up to the fact, and for a while it looked as though the Kickstarter campaign would have to be cancelled. However, Oliver's inalienable ownership of both logos, handcrafted artwork, not typescript, meant that, like Imagine, Future would have a problem with using the Crash and Zzap rights, so an agreement was reached which suited all parties. The same is now true of the planned Zzap 64 annual and the second one for Crash. Getting back to working on a magazine I edited so many years ago was strange, nostalgic, and proved how much I'd forgotten. But it has been interesting, if a little hectic at times. Against some opposition, I stopped it being a sort of Christmas special and insisted on using design layouts from my classic period 1984 to 86. Having the luxury of colour throughout was both a delight and a drawback. There's a temptation to overdo it. Headings that had previously been black and white in the day suddenly came screaming back in glorious colours. Lloyd Mangrum had to put his foot down firmly to retain those flying letterpage tops of Oliver's in the monochrome line. I hope we did the old Crash justice with its reappearance as an annual, as I hope we will with Zzap 64.
Thank you. And now we have some friends, old, new, influential and inspirational, with a few questions of their own. It's the quick fire round. Julian Rignall, Zzap 64 editor and staff writer, asks, Oliver and Roger, why did you choose Ludlow as the home for Newsfield?
I can understand why so many people, from the eventual readership to the media, were surprised to see a publisher of computer games based in Ludlow. The almost standard response to the question, where do you live, was, where's that? Never heard of Ludlow. In today's interconnected e-world, the idea of working on something associated with technology in any location, city or rural, it's no longer surprising. But in the early 1980s, computer meant at least urban, in a city most likely.
Fascinating. Tell me more.
ITV's Central Television News in December 1984 certainly thought the Newsfield story was worth an item. The very fact that a bunch of schoolboys in the unlikely setting of the ancient market town was dictating the fortunes of the growing game software business was astonishing.
That's remarkable.
The relationship with Ludlow went back to the long hot summer of 1976 and the annual Ludlow Festival, which included as its centrepiece the 2-week performance of a Shakespeare play. The play that year was Hamlet, and in the stellar cast, Paul Jones of Manfred Mann fame, Leslie Ann Down, Gwen Watford, Peter Jones and Leonard Whiting. Google if you don't know them, was a friend playing the part of Laertes. Oliver and I first met Ralph Lawton at the London Film School when he acted in a student exercise of ours. We decided to see the play and stayed 2 nights at Ludlow's famous Feathers Hotel, recently infamous for an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease.
OMG.
Actors and stage crew were usually billeted with locals, and Ralph was staying with 2 others at the company in a large house owned by a certain Mary Pitter. When she'd asked if we'd like to come back for the rest of the week, being our own bosses, we agreed, and so began a friendship with Mary that lasted until her death some 10 years ago. When it came time to abandon London 6 years later, Ludlow seemed the best bet, and with house prices at less than a third of similar properties in London, we bought 85 Old Street. Newsfield and Crash were not on the radar at the end of 1982. They were happy accidents of fate, and Ludlow, especially the schoolboy reviewers, were the first beneficiaries.
Zzap 64 because we launched the first diary, the first programmer diary about Paraguay in Zzap 64 after I had a beer with the editor, Chris Anderson, in the pub.
Graham Axten, author of Commodore 64 games The Bare Essentials and Donkey Kong, asks, for Oliver, are there any non-Thalamus games from the era that Thalamus were active, where you looked at the cover art and thought, I'd like to have had a go at that cover art? And to Roger, are there any non-Thalamus games from the era that Thalamus were active, where you looked at the game and thought, I wish we could have had that on the Thalamus label?
No. No. No.
As I pointed out earlier, I kept myself so aloof from the company that it would have been unlikely that I would spot something that I wished we'd had for Thalamus.
Wow, okay.
Hi, my name is Paul Docherty. I am a filmmaker, but I used to be a Commodore 64 graphics artist, and I was a big fan of Zzap 64 back in the day. But I remember seeing Oliver Frey's artwork in Look and Learn magazine when I was a kid. Oliver Frey's artwork was in the Trigon Empire, and I was a big fan of that. So when I saw Ollie's art on the cover of Zzap 64, that was just a selling point for me. I was so in. I had a Commodore 64. I was a fan of Ollie, and it was a thrill to see what Ollie was doing every month with his new art. So that is a very happy memory for my Commodore 64 days.
Chris Abbott, the owner of C64audio.com, asks, what led you to work with C64 composer Rob Hubbard, and what do you think of his work both for Thalamus and in general?
I think the people who really have to answer this question are Andrew Wright and Gary Liddon, although I'm sure Gary Penn and Julian Rignall would have pushed for someone of Rob's creative skill. After all, the cream of Commodore 64 musicians were not infrequent Ludlow visitors.
Welcome, Gary Liddon. Can you fill in for us?
Of course. Roger's enormous skill was to let people do what they want with just the right amount of dadgish oversight if it went way off the rails. So Rog, Ollie, weren't really involved on that front. I'd known Rob for a while and loved his stuff, and we got on well. Synaxian needed some music, so we approached him. Andrew was the MD for Thalamus, and I was the tech guy. So Rob just did what he wanted for the loader, which is fantastic. It was a tune he'd done previously on Simps for some music competition. We also asked him for the music from Romeo and Juliet. For Delta, we asked for something along the lines of On the Run by Pink Floyd and described what I wanted to do for the loader, and Rob supplied the individual bits of music you could remix while loading. But I nicked the idea from a mate who'd done something similar on the BBC Micro. Me and Andrew left after Delta, so I've not really got much beyond that.
So Gary, you left Thalamus after 2 hugely successful and well-received debut games. Why so soon?
Me and Andrew asked for a profit share. We did pretty much most of the work by negotiating the distro deal with US Gold, but it wasn't forthcoming, so we fucked off.
Oh my god.
Also, we were young, and I'm really annoying. Even if Usold had acquiesced, he would have likely have imploded not long after.
Bloody hell, did that really happen? Vanya Utne, artist, musician, coder and member of Pond Software, where she has recently made the wonderful cover art for the new C64 game The Bare Essentials, asks, do you think you will ever finish the second series of Terminal Man?
Sadly, I don't think so now. Several times the idea has bubbled up, but the narrative drive behind the second series of Terminal Man, which we did begin to publish, has faded over time. And to be honest, I don't think I have the energy for comic strips now.
Martin C. Grundy is Commodore 64 superfan and a blogger. He has two questions for Roger. In issue 74, Zzap ditched the Amiga and reverted to C64 only coverage. This seems an odd move, as by 91 the Amiga scene was flourishing while the C64 was in steep decline. What factors led to that decision? Also, Crash and Zzap were massively successful magazines. They ran for years and earned a special place in the hearts of Spectrum and Commodore 64 gamers. Yet Amtix, Newsfield's AMSTRAD magazine, only ran for 18 months. Why was Amtix so short-lived?
I know with hindsight that it seems entirely logical that Zzap 64 should have seeked effortlessly into an Amiga publication over the period of a year or two, but I don't think I quite saw it like that at the time. Unfortunately, I cannot remember why the decision to drop the Amiga was made, and at the time I was more involved in general management duties, particularly the development of full-scale electronic production and editing and designing pre-press, that's a subscription-based journal, about the new world of electronic publishing. Zzap 64 editors of the day, Stuart Wynne or Phil King, might have a better answer as to why the Amiga was dropped. I think the answer to why Amtix was so short-lived, only 18 issues, has probably been spoken about earlier.
You know, I don't think Crash understood me or my Football Manager game, but it was a good magazine.
Peter Ward, webmaster of Retro Games Master website, asks, what did you want to do when you were at school for a career and what was your first job?
When I started at Highgate School in North London aged 13, I wanted to be a civil airline pilot. In my near decade of living in Nigeria as a child, toing and froing between holidays in Lagos and prep school in the UK, I was flying in big BOAC aeroplanes. My dad was also the chief electrical power engineer for Nigeria's airports, and we lived on the edge of Lagos Airport, so flying was my everything. And in my pre-joining interview, the headmaster of Highgate asked me what I saw as my future career. I replied, airline pilot. I quailed at the stern look he gave me, and then he addressed my father very firmly, saying, don't concern yourself, Mr. Kean, we'll soon get that out of him. Highgate turned out financial wizards at one end and musical geniuses at the other. Lowly flyers didn't crack it.
Fascinating. Tell me more.
As it happened, my eyesight went AWOL, so I decided to be a doctor-surgeon next. But poor A-level results in chemistry and physics kiboshed that. That left me with my other great love, painting. And I was lucky to study art A-level under Highgate's two great teachers, the painters Sir John Kiffin Williams and Anthony Green. Between them, they got me into the Hornsey College of Art, where I did the foundation course between 66 and 67, and I was elected to a 3-year Diplomacy of Art Design course at Hornsey in Fine Arts Painting. Anthony Green always told me that an art school course qualified one to be nothing more than a teacher of art, and if I wanted to make some money, I'd better go and learn plumbing. In the event, the Student Rebellion of the summer of 1968 changed the course of my life. To keep students in college overnight for the 6 weeks of the endless sit-in, constant films were played, donated by sympathetic distributors. I got the film bug, and in January 1969, I started a 2-year course at the LFS, the then dubbed London School of Film Technique, and that is where I met Oliver.
Here's the problem. When I was growing up, my first computer was a Dragon 32, and boy oh boy, I got bullied mercilessly for that. My second computer was a BBC Micro. Luckily it was a Model B+. We got it from Rumbelows in Maidenhead, and we bought it because it was educational. Thanks Mum, thanks Dad. Although I've got one back there actually, so I do love it. And growing up, I never had a Speccy and I never had a C64, and I would look at them both lovingly. I'd read computer games magazines and just dream of owning a Commodore 64. I'd go into W.H. Smith's on a Saturday morning when my mum was shopping in Slough. She would dump me off in Smith's or Boots, and I would stand by the C64, the shape, the keys, the buttons. Oh! Now I'm an old man, I can afford to buy these little treats for myself. So I bought an array of retro video games consoles. I've got a C64, I have got a Spectrum. And I'm also buying magazines. I'm also buying magazines that are associated with these old computers. So I've spent last night about 25 quid on a handful of Crash. A handful, 25 quid. What am I trying to do? Am I trying to recreate feelings of 12-year-old me? Am I going to look in there longingly and buy more bits and pieces? I have no idea why I'm doing it, but I do know those Crash magazines are beautiful. They're works of art. We need to preserve them. We need to treasure them. They need to be read, and they will be read. Computer gaming is part of our social history, and the collecting and the logging of it now will be thanked by future generations.
Steve, the manager of the Telford branch of the UK's leading video game store, asks, "Your art for Crash and Zzap jumped between high fantasy and science fiction. Which style do you prefer?"
I marginally prefer high fantasy to science fiction, but I mostly love history.
I see. One for Roger also. Who was the fictional Lloyd Mangram based on?
On leaving school, I was immediately snapped up as a freelance film editor around the corner at Sorrel Films in Long Acre. There I worked with Jeff Harvey, a young editor of great skill, and he taught me more in a few months than I'd learned in 2 years of study. Together, and for several years, we worked on sports documentaries, including the official Wimbledon and British Open golf films, and in one of the latter, the veteran American golfer Lloyd Mangram was playing his last Open, more of a guest than a competitor, and on a par 3 hole scored a hole-in-one. I will never forget it. When we needed to flesh out the fledgling Crash masthead with staff, I used Lloyd's name, only changing the last vowel to protect the innocent.
I don't believe it.
At Graph Gold we had every newsfeel edition of Crash and Zzap. It was our Encyclopedia Britannica, and we used it all the time as a reference to see what other people were doing, and of course to see what they thought of us.
Mark Hardesty, author of the highly acclaimed book A Gremlin in the Works, that took an in-depth look at the history of legendary British software house Gremlin Graphics, asks, in a Hollywood film of the 80s computer game industry, who would play the main protagonists: Geoff Brown, Anne Brown, David Worth, John Woods, Ian Stewart and the rest.
The usual suspects.
Well, basically, the bottom line is Crash and Zzap were the only real magazines that I would even give any credence to. I did buy the other magazines, but you go for the shiny, glossy ones, really, and Crash and Zzap ticked every single box where a game player could be remotely interested.
And finally, Mark Hellewell, also known as Lord Rs, social media star with over 100,000 followers and ZX Spectrum devotee featured in the movie Memoirs of a Spectrum Addict, asks, LM, the men's lifestyle magazine, was launched in 1986. Do you think that it was possibly before its time, considering magazines such as Maxim and Loaded have since done so well, yet didn't appear until nearly a decade later? Also, over 30 years on, could you finally divulge what LM actually stands for?
With Zzap 64 and Crash selling really well, and Amtix struggling against AMSTRAD action, Franco, Oliver and I considered the need for a magazine that might take Newsfield into other fields and not just computer games. And in April 1986 we took ourselves off to the Lobster Pot in Mousehole, Cornwall, for a long weekend to brainstorm ideas. The outcome was a youth lifestyle periodical, and we gave it a working title of LM, a name that stuck.
Fascinating. Tell me more.
Between then and the December launch, a lot of work went into recruiting an editorial team, which meant Centrism raises its head again, a London-based team, and I suspect tensions were present almost immediately between the young professionals, some snatched from smash hits, and Newsfield's ruralists in Ludlow.
Incredible. Such history.
I found it ironic that the look down their noses at Ludlow Londoners were sitting and working in the very same offices that Oliver and I had for knocking out Street Level's game magazines only 4 years earlier when we were as London as they were. In spite of the frictions, I think we put together a pretty radical magazine for all that. Or perhaps because of it.
I never expected anything like that.
LM was clearly ahead of its time, not as raunchy as the later Loaded or other lads magazines. But the AIDS article we ran resulted in valuable advertising being pulled, particularly by a frosty CNA, and that contributed to the financial losses that began to threaten the security of Newsfield's computer games side, and it was with great regret that I agreed to can LM.
Bloody hell.
As for the name, well, keeping people guessing was part of the game. Lloyd Mangram's Monthly, Leisure Magazine, Lime Marmalade, who knew? At the time, when questioned, I usually retorted that if EMAP could have Q, what's wrong with Newsfield's LM, hey?